Starlog Magazine. This is episode 58.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casto, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
A notable magazine that covered science fiction, TV, and film got its start in 1976, largely because of Star Trek. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casto. Yeah, Starlog began as a one-shot to honor the canceled show, but quickly became a mainstay in the science fiction and horror genres through 2008.
And we're going to talk about Starlog, but first, let's tell everyone how they can reach us. Just visit our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/70strek.
You can also send us an email to 70strek@gmail.com. And the show is also on iTunes, of course. Just search for 70s Trek in the podcast section. While you're there, please leave a rating or a review because it will help others find the show.
In 1976, for the first time in 10 years, fans could see former Beatle Paul McCartney live in concert as he toured around the world with his new band, Wings. And also in 1976, and I love this story, the producer of Saturday Night Live, Lorne Michaels, performs a unique on-air gag. He holds up a check for $3,000 and appeals to the Beatles to get together on his show. You can reunite here. You guys know all the songs. And at one point, he even says, if you want to give less to Ringo, that's up to you. What he doesn't know is that John Lennon and Paul McCartney are watching live at Lennon's home in New York City and almost decide to drive down to the SNL studios.
Oh, man.
Can you imagine that?
Wish they would have.
That's right. And also in 1976, it was the year that two publishing professionals started a magazine that looked at science fiction films and television, and they called it Starlog. Kelly, you have the story from there, right?
Sure. So Starlog Magazine, first published in August 1976 by Carrie Quinn and Norman Jacobs. Now, Quinn was the magazine's editor, and Jacobs ran the business aspect, like, you know, the typesetters and the engravers and the printers and dealing with all that stuff.
The business side.
The business side. These guys got their start actually publishing a soap opera magazine. So
wait a minute, what?
Yeah, yes, the soap opera magazine.
And so they decided to branch out into sci-fi.
Right. Now, the original idea, though, started with O'Quinn and a high school friend, David Houston. Now, David's in the mix here throughout the history of Starlog as well. But they talked about creating a magazine that would cover the science fiction films and television programs.
Were they fans?
What's that?
Were they fans of the genre?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, big time.
Okay.
So when they're actually starting this out and trying to come up with an idea, you know, they had a brainstorming session and they were discussing the legal aspects. And there was a little problem because they wanted to do strictly a one-shot, Star Trek-focused magazine. Now, Paramount comes along and they want royalties. And it ended up these royalties that Paramount wanted was going to be much greater than what their projected net receipts would be.
Oh, come on, Paramount.
Yeah. Yeah. So they decided, you know, through this brainstorming session to figure out how to get around it. And they thought, well, let's just go back to our original concept, you know, and O'Quinn and Houston's concept, and just cover all of sci-fi and the fantasy, the horror at the time. So that's what they decided to do.
So by becoming a magazine, they didn't have to worry about paying the royalties?
Right, because it was more like a newspaper type of thing. Yeah,
Gotcha.
They're covering the industry.
Gotcha.
So they published Starlog. They started off as a quarterly magazine, and they did this mainly to, cut down on costs, because it took a lot less to produce a magazine every quarter, obviously, than every month or every other month or whatever. But they sold out their first issue.
Did it really?
Sold out. So they decided very quickly, hey, let's do this every 6 weeks. And so you see the history of it. The first year, it's basically every 6 weeks.
That's interesting, because I was noticing the publishing dates. It's like August, November, right. January, March, and you're right. They are. At first, I just thought, well, maybe it's just infrequent and they did it when they could. But now that you're saying every 6 weeks, I get it. I see the pattern now.
Yeah. So O'Quinn, like I said, was the first editor. And then over time, there were other editors. Houston became one of the editors for about a year. And another gentleman, Howard Zimmerman, took over for Houston when he was promoted to some other role. So, and then David McConnell took over after Zimmerman.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. So, now this was Starlog was the first publication to report on the development of Star Wars.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What was the landscape like, Kelly? Were there other sci-fi magazines dedicated to film and TV going on at the time, or was Starlog the first? Starlog
was really about the real first one that was consistent. There were like one-shot type things. Like we see some of those now when you go to the newsstand and you see, a one-shot of a movie or something. But
right.
It was kind of like that back then. This was the first one, though, dedicated to sci-fi and published regularly.
Nice.
Then, they followed Star Wars. They followed Star Trek, the motion pictures we'll talk about here shortly. And it turned out to be, at least at the time when it ended, it was one of the longest running and one of the most popular publications of that type.
So what we did was take a look at the issues to see what Star Trek news appears in them. We're not going to give you a blow-by-blow, issue-by-issue detail, but we did want to discuss the highlights as they relate to Star Trek during those issues that appear in the 1970s. And we start with the first issue, August 1976. And actually, there's a lot of Trek stuff in here, mainly because it was supposed to be, as Kelly said, a one-shot that was dedicated to Star Trek. So there's a lot here, including that beautiful color painting on the cover of Kirk and Spock and the Enterprise.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It is. It's very cool. And then, of course, there are a lot of good articles in here. One is Star Trek Past, Present, and Future by Houston. A special collector's section, Star Trek in color, with some nice photographs. Isaac Asimov talks about the conventions. There's an article called William Shatner, Shakespeare to the Stars. It's kind of a corny title, but it's 1976.
Yeah.
There's an article about Leonard Nimoy, The Man Between the Ears. Okay, that one also getting really corny. But again, we'll give it to him. It's the first episode.
Yeah, right.
But what I really thought was cool was they had a complete guide to all of the Star Trek episodes. And in 1976, pre-internet, a lot of Star Trek publications, this was one of the first times you could get an episode guide.
Right.
So that's kind of cool. Issue number 2 came out in November 76. It has an article about Gene Roddenberry called Two Men in One. There's also an article called The Star Trek Movie. It's untitled, unwritten, and uncast, but it's about to go into orbit. So, they're trying to cover Trek as much as possible. There was also a neat section in here called Famous Trekkies that included quotes from Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, Rod Serling, and author James Blish that we have talked about in the past, and an announcement about the TV show In Search Of. because it was going to feature as its host Leonard Nimoy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Issue number 3 was January 1977. The cover had a cartoon of the Trek cast hanging from a chandelier at a convention, trying to show all the chaos there, you know.
Yeah, it was funny.
It was
Great
funny.
cover.
There's an article about how NASA has renamed the first shuttle the Enterprise. There's also an article called the Star Trek Bicentennial 10 Convention. Bicentennial for 1976 and 10 being the 10-year 10-year anniversary of Star Trek. When you put that together, Star Trek Bicentennial 10, it didn't really work, I thought, but
No.
An ad for Gene Roddenberry's album Inside Star Trek, which we're going to talk about here in a few episodes, and an ad for Trek, the magazine for Star Trek fans. That's interesting. Yeah. Issue number 4, March 1977. It has a 2-page spread on Captain Kirk and the Gorn. That's some pictures of Captain Kirk fighting the Gorn. It's not a spread like you would find in adult magazines. I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that.
Good.
Issue
I don't need a centerfold.
Gorn. Yes, right. No, of a Gorn or Captain Kirk. Yes. Issue 5, May 1977, a report on William Shatner's college speaking tour. David Gerald writes about pressure that he has received from some Baptist leaders that actually resulted in changing an animated series episode, and he talks about that experience. And there's an article about how a Star Trek episode was censored by a Texas TV station back in the 60s. Issue number 6, June 77. There's an article called To the Limits of Imagination, Animating Star Trek. And they also include an animated series episode guide. Now, here's where things get real interesting. For the first time, there is a section called Star Trek Report. It is a column by Gene Roddenberry's assistant, Susan Sackett. And this column will appear in every issue of the magazine, all the way right up to the release of Star Trek, the motion picture. So in this section, Star Trek Report, Susan says that the new project, Star Trek, the motion picture, she calls it that, even though that was only a working title way, way back in June 77. And that title changes later on. The script is by British writers Chris Bryant and Alan Scott. Alan Scott is not the Alan Scott who is the first Green Lantern, so don't make that connection and get confused, kids. They are writing the aborted film, though, Star Trek, Planet of Titans. And the production was set to start in August 1977. Now, it's June when this is being reported. Go back about 3 or 4 months, so we're really talking sometime in February when this all was beginning to come about. So they thought that getting to August would be enough time. With a release date, they were thinking July 1978. So that's kind of interesting to see how none of that happened.
But, and not to be confused, just for me, she's talking about Star Trek, the motion picture, but really the writers are not doing the end result.
No, they're writing the Planet of Titans script. Yep, that never got made. Issue 7, August 1977, a preview of the movie Star Wars. Maybe you've heard of it. It's been around a little bit. A blurb about NASA hiring Nichelle Nichols. Kind of neat. And then the Star Trek report. Susan talks about the Star Trek script for the Planet of Titans, even though she doesn't call it that, by Chris Bryant and not the first Green Lantern, Alan Scott. That is done, and those writers have moved on to other non-Star Trek projects. And she does mention that script is being rewritten. A second draft is being done on it, though she doesn't say who is doing it. We find out later that it's actually Phil Kaufman, the man who was picked to direct Planet of Titans. There's also a paragraph in this particular report about Paul McCartney asking Gene Roddenberry to work on a project in 1976 and 1977. And we have talked about that in the past, something that Gene was doing. At the time, Susan thought that project would come to fruition and be released sometime in 1978. Never happened. She also mentioned that Gene was working on another project called Battleground Earth. And we've heard of this project because it came about, when did that come about? Late 90s, 2000s?
Something like that.
Yeah. Well, Gene was also working on the novelization for The God Thing. If you remember, that was going to be the novel from his first Star Trek movie script that was the first rejection by Paramount way back in 1975.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. And there's an article by, or actually about screenwriter Alan Scott, again, not the first Green Lantern, as he talks about Star Trek, the movie, not the motion picture, would go on to be known as Planet of Titans, was never made. Just trying to make sure everybody's on the same page with us. Issue 8, September 77, a blurb about how Shatner's college tour recordings are now a 2-record album. I don't remember ever seeing it. I'd love to get my hands on it. If anybody listening knows how we can get that, oh, please let us know. In the Star Trek report, Susan Sackett reports that Paramount rejected the most recent script by Bryant and Scott. That is the script for Planet of Titans. Rejected. Director Phil Kaufman, she reports, proposed a new idea for Planet of Titans. It, too, was rejected. So, after 2 years, there's no script. There are no ideas. We're kind of spinning our wheels here. But good news.
This is September.
This is, yes, this was reported in September 77, so you have to assume it's back around June.
Right.
Good news, Paramount made a new development offer to Gene, though. And I found this kind of interesting. By September 77, he had not yet accepted the deal. And she doesn't go into a lot of detail about what the deal is because she doesn't know what it is. And before this issue went to press, the publishers called Susan on the phone. So there's a side column next to the Star Trek report, which we think was written around June 77. This phone call takes place in September 77. And in the phone call, she makes the announcement that Paramount was forming a 4th television network, and Star Trek would be the big deal show, the big anchor show on it. I said the big deal show. Isn't that?
The big deal.
Is that a thing? I'm not sure.
Sure it is.
It's
a game show.
It is now. And there's also a guide to, I just threw this in there because I thought it was fun. There was also a guide to the Saturday morning TV shows from 1976. Some of those shows that we used to watch include Arc 2, Electra Woman, Land of the Lost, The New Adventures of Batman, Shazam, Isis, Super Friends, and Space Ghost.
Space
Ghost. Issue 9, October 1977, an article with William Shatner. It's called Moving Right Along. I think he was moving right along away from Trek at this time. In the Star Trek report, Star Trek is now officially reported to be a new TV series. The original cast is returning. There may be some new characters as well, and at the time, Susan Sackett thought production was going to begin by the fall of 1977 with projected air dates of spring 1978. So October 77 is the date of this issue. Somewhere back around July, this announcement's made, and Paramount is now gearing up to launch a new network and a new TV series for Star Trek. Issue 10, December 77, the end of the year. In the Star Trek report, Susan Sackett reports that the entire cast reunited on the Paramount lot to meet the new production team. Even Grace Lee Whitney was there. Shatner was not there, though. Nimoy was not there, and Takei was not there. They were all working, and they couldn't get away from the projects they were working on at the time. And she also reports that construction on the Enterprise sets had started earlier in the fall, and there was a lot of progress being made. Issue 11, January 78, Star Trek report. All actors except Nimoy had signed on on for the new version of Star Trek. And Grace Lee Whitney would be back as a recurring character. There's also a new writer's guide, and there are new characters. Lieutenant Ilea. Somehow we'll get to know her later.
Yeah.
Commander Will Decker. I think we'll get to know him later. And Lieutenant Zahn. I'm pretty sure we will not get to know him later. And the new characters are there mainly to attract younger viewers because they're scared that the Star Trek crew is 10 years older and nobody will care.
Right.
The new model for the Enterprise is also being constructed and redesigned, and they say they're going to tell us more about that. Issue 12, March 1978, there's an article called The Making of Star Trek II. This is not Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, but Star Trek, the second version, not yet called Phase 2. So it's a conversation with Gene Roddenberry. At the top of the article, though, and again, we're saying the issue date is March 78, so you have to assume this was around December. So right before they went to press, Starlog took a big piece of the margin and put a statement above the article. Basically, that statement said that the TV project Phase 2 is dead, and Paramount has decided to do a major motion picture. But the interviews were already done and already written, and they were all about Phase 2, so they ran the interview anyway. I mean, think about it. In the print analog world at that time, what were you going to do?
Right.
If this magazine went to press on March 1, I don't know when it went to press, I'm just saying it, February 15th, 1978, and you get a call on the 13th, and this means you might wipe out a 4-page article for one column of, hey, this announcement came out. I mean, what do? It's not like a computer. Like today, you can change things very, very quickly. They couldn't change things. So
typesetting.
Yeah, right. So they put that announcement in the margin because they had the space to do it there and just rolled forward. In the Star Trek report, which, again, we're thinking goes back a few months, Susan Sackett says back in October of 1977, 16 young actors and actresses did screen tests for new roles for Star Trek Phase 2. Here we are again reporting Phase 2 news.
Yes.
But we just learned it's dead. And she writes something which is kind of interesting, though. She says that it was the first time any Star Trek project had been shot at Paramount since 1969. And then she dropped this bomb, and I'm quoting her here, quote, Leonard Nimoy has accepted a starring role in the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, directed by Phil Kaufman. Stepping out of the quote, that's the guy that was supposed to direct Planet of Titans, back into the quote, and has already begun filming, so he will not be returning as Mr. Spock, unquote. And then she goes on to describe the colors on the set walls. It was a really casual way of making this major announcement. And I'm really not de-emphasizing it here. That's about how it appeared. It was paragraph, 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 the Leonard Nimoy thing, and then paragraph, paragraph. She just went on. It was just like that. Oh, by the way, he's out.
Right.
Think about that. That was a huge deal.
That is.
Yeah. And there's also an article called Special Report on the New Enterprise. Issue 13, May 78. Star Trek Report. Quote, Paramount Pictures has now committed several $1 million to a Star Trek motion picture we hope will surpass both Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind in both quality and impact, unquote. Kelly, did they achieve that?
We'll see.
Yes, we'll see later. The fate of the TV series is uncertain until after the release of the movie, which they thought would be December 1978. But there's talk that maybe there will be a TV series too. So at this time, it's not completely flushed away. Also in the Star Trek report, Paramount was afraid that a TV version of Star Trek would suffer in comparison to Star Wars or Close Encounters. They were really afraid that a TV version of Trek would be compared to those two movies, which is another reason why they decided to go with the motion picture. Thought that was kind of interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Issue 14, June 1978. A text of the Saturday Night Live script, The Last Voyage of the Starship Enterprise, is in this issue. That is the skit with John Belushi as Kirk and Chevy Chase as Spock, and NBC decides to cancel the show. It's a classic. If you've never seen it, and I don't know why you would listen to this show if you haven't seen it. If you've never seen it, go to YouTube. It is well worth the 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, definitely.
In the Star Trek report, the production is slated to begin in April or May of 1978 on the motion picture. Gene Roddenberry is completing work on the final script, and Robert Collins was signed to direct. Remember that name, Robert Collins.
Robert Collins.
Because he will not go on to direct that movie. Issue 15, August 1978, in the Star Trek report. We're looking back to March 28th now. Paramount announced that the motion picture was a go at a large press gathering with the entire cast. Yes, finally.
Yay.
Yeah. Do you remember reading Parade magazine on Sundays in the paper?
Yes.
Do you know, I remember seeing this in Parade magazine. I'm not kidding. With the spread of the whole cast and the big, it had Star Trek and those 20s kind of font and the big photo. I just remember it. It doesn't matter. I just thought I'd mention that.
It was the best part of the Sunday newspaper.
Yes. Okay, Starlog reports in the Star Trek report. That doesn't make any sense. Let me move on. That Robert Wise is now the director. So Robert Collins, as I predicted just a few moments ago, is out. Robert Wise is now in, and production was set to begin now, July 1978, with a release date of July 1979. Kelly, that was my 15 issues. You pick it up at issue 16, right?
16, yes. Issue 16, which was out September 1978. Susan Sackett, Star Trek report. She's showcasing some big color photos showing the back of this computerized bridge set, all kinds of wires and everything. But it's from the back of a bridge set from the unrealized second Star Trek series.
Oh, from Phase 2.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So, but it was, being a computer geek and liking that stuff, that was kind of cool. See the pictures.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing in this issue, Mick Jarvis writes about the new Invasion of the Body Snatcher film starring Leonard Nimoy. Now, Mick Jarvis, I guess, goes on to be a movie director. Who knows?
I don't know.
I don't know either. All right. Issue 17 came out October 1978. This is kind of foreshadowing. Kerry O'Quinn writes in his column from the bridge. He has a nightmare about the movie studio destroying the Star Trek movie.
Oh, really?
Dun, dun, dun. Yes.
Well, that's weird.
Yeah. There's also an interview with Gene Roddenberry, talking, of course, about Star Trek, the motion picture, and they're calling it the motion picture now. Gene says he would like to make a series of regular Star Trek movies, kind of similar to the series, the 007 series. And he thinks that there's a future there. So it's kind of interesting perspective.
A future.
Yes.
There's a future there. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Susan Sackett's Star Trek report. She's given an update on the movie and just really talking about makeup and the costumes, the story edits. But she says filming started August 7th, 1978. So this is October. She's now officially reporting it started on August 7th.
Cool.
All right. Issue 18, which came out December 1978. And I have to say this. They talk about Jerry Anderson's space report reflects on the Space 1999 convention in Columbus, Ohio. So,
it was in Columbus.
Yes.
Nice.
And Susan Sackett's Star Trek report, she's describing the first scenes of the filming. So basically the Enterprise bridge, and there's actual pictures kind of behind the scenes, Kirk sitting on the captain's chair with Gene talking to him or whatever. There's a couple interesting photos there. All right. We'll move to issue 19, which came out February 1978. And I have to do this. Norm Jacobs is trying to do this this Starlog branding thing. And he purchases a racehorse and names it Starlog. So it's just kind of weird. The things that catch your eye.
Seriously.
Another interesting thing from my perspective. Sorry, this isn't much Star Trek. David Gerald has an article that's called "A Parsec in a Pear Tree," or "What Makes a Kessel Run."
Oh my! Really?
Yes.
That's funny.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny. I think he got some heat and letters in later issues.
He should for that. Yes, he should.
And Susan's Star Trek report, she's basically talking about what's going on in the dailies. And that's a big thing in Hollywood, in the film industry, is reading the dailies to see what's going on. So she's covering what's being said about Star Trek in the dailies, talks about the set security, and she talks about the Star Trek softball team. We'll get to more of that.
Not known as the DS9ers, right?
No, maybe later. All right. Issue 20 came out March 79. Susan's Star Trek report. She talks about that big crew assembly scene in Star Trek the motion picture, because there's several people, including several people from Starlog Magazine, in that that group of people, including, we know Bijo's there. We've talked to Bijo about that. Richard Arnold, David Gerald, and Fred Bronson, to name a few. So I think Susan was in there as well.
Cool.
All right. Issue 21, which came out in April 79. This gets kind of interesting, and this is kind of a side of Star Trek, so sorry, but there's a big feud going on between Mark Hamill and Harlan Ellison. And Harlan does several articles in Starlog.
What? Wait a minute. Harlan Ellison and Luke Skywalker are arguing about what?
Yes. Well, it turns out Harlan isn't afraid to state his opinions, both,
No,
publicly and in writing.
Nice, quiet young man. Really?
Right. So Harlan is not a fan of Star Wars. And so this feud between Mark Hamill and Harlan kind of starts with an interview that Mark did. And he says, Harlan Ellison wrote one article in which he said something like, "Not only is Luke Skywalker a nerd, but Darth Vader sucks runny eggs."
Oh, my.
And Mark continues, "That's a wonderful effect, and he really should be a lounge act in Las Vegas. I don't think it's worthy of him, with the reputation he has as a wonderfully imaginative science fiction writer, to lower himself that way. Why should I think his opinion is important when I know my opinion isn't important?"
Jeez.
Yeah. So that was the interview in writing in Starlog that Mark gave. More on this. This is a continuing drama. Susan Sackett's Star Trek report. She's just doing normal kind of updates on what's going on in the Star Trek set. And another interesting thing in this issue, there's an article on science fiction models, including a science fiction model checklist of models up to that point. Issue 22, which came out May 1979, there is, in the short news, in log entries, there's an insight into the motion picture's only outdoor set. It was a recreation of Minerva's Terrace. So it's kind of a weird alien-looking structure. It's kind of neat. And
that was the only outdoor set?
That's what it's reporting.
Huh.
Go figure.
Go figure.
Susan Sackett's Star Trek report. She's noting the end of principal filming on the motion picture.
Ah, great.
And she writes, speaking of sets, things are looking good for at least one sequel movie, since all of the valuable sets have been stored on Stage 9. So that's kind of interesting. So they're storing the sets. So
yeah, it's all wrapped.
Yeah, but they're storing them on a stage, so they're going to use them again, hopefully.
Right.
There's also an article on alien masks from Star Trek, the motion picture.
Oh, neat.
Yeah. Issue 23 came out June 79. Now Harlan picks up the feud here, and he's replying to Mark Hamill's comments. And he says this: Mr. Hamill's confusion about my attitude towards the little film in which he appeared is touching. Equally touching is his understanding of the unimportance of his opinions.
Wow.
And in the Susan Sackett Star Trek report, she's talking about the post-production coverage, and like she does in most others, is answering a bunch of questions about Star Trek. Most of these are Star Trek the Motion Picture questions. Now we get to issue 24, July of 1979. This is the third anniversary double-size issue.
Oh,
so
cool.
This is actually, if you ever go out and look for a Starlog issue to look at this one. It gives the roots of Starlog by Carrie O'Quinn, much better than I portrayed. Susan's Star Trek report, she's doing some more news about the movie, and she's talking about Bill Shatner is also an active player on our Star Trek softball team. There's also two other interviews on this with Shatner called The Captain is Speaking, or This is the Captain Speaking, and Leonard Nimoy has an interview, and it is entitled He is Spock.
That's funny.
Now, issue 25 and kind of issue 24 are probably considered the year of Star Trek. This is the year that the motion picture is coming out and everything. So it's heavy Star Trek for some of these issues. So 25 came out in August 1979. There's a beautiful cover painting of the USS Enterprise, and it's the Enterprise from the movie. And in the center of the magazine is also a full centerfold of the Enterprise. This Enterprise, it's
cool.
Beautiful.
Cool.
Susan Sackett Star Trek report. She's doing trivia and teasers. And so here's an example. And Bob, this is a test. Which actor has an LEMLI on his car's license plate? And what does it stand for?
Yeah, no clue.
No? Okay. It's the name of Shatner's music company. Didn't know he had a music company.
Mm-mm.
And an acronym for his three daughters, Leslie, Melanie, and Elizabeth.
Didn't know that.
So there's like 10 or 15 of those. There's an interview in this issue with artist and Trek production designer Mike Miner. There's a look at AMT models of the original Enterprise and how you can light them using fiber optics.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And there is a very interesting sidebar called the FX mess, related to the Star Trek motion picture special effects mess is what they're referring to here. And what they talk about is how the special effects were originally budgeted a certain amount, but because they more than doubled the special effects scenes, that this is one of the reasons why the cost of the movie skyrocketed.
Go figure. Imagine that.
Yep.
It might cost a little bit more when you double the need.
Right. All right. Issue 26 came out in September 1979. And Susan Sackett and the Star Trek reports talking about the audio side of the motion picture and what was going on. David Gerald, he's comparing Star Trek to the later sci-fi TV productions, such as Space 1999, Battlestar Galactica, and he says both pale in comparison, with a quote saying Battlestar isn't even that hopeful in its premises. 9/10 of the human race has been wiped out, and the survivors are fleeing the enemy Cylons, a race of chrome robots. I fail to understand why a robot even wants an oxygen atmosphere planet. Oxygen encourages rust. The premise here is even less honorable. They're after us. Let's run like hell. So that kind of struck a chord with me.
That's funny.
Yeah. All right. Issue 27 came out October 1979, and they did a behind-the-scenes look at model makers, specifically the models and the special effects for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Mm-hmm. And Susan Sackett is talking about the Klingons in the motion picture. All right, I'm going to skip to issue 29, which came out December 1979. And Susan Sackett's Star Trek Report explains what the movie's cast has been doing since they finished shooting the film. So, for example, Grace Lee Whitney's recording some original music, which we know some of that's based off of Star Trek. Mm-hmm. Now on to issue 30, which came out January 1980. The cover of this issue is of the motion picture with Kirk looking ahead, Spock looking to one side, and the Enterprise coming head on at you. It's kind of a cool picture or cover. There's an excerpt, and this is first of three from Walter Koenig's book, Chekhov's Enterprise. And there's a big article here about Star Trek's special effects debacle. And David Gerald says, at $42 million, Star Trek will be the most expensive motion picture ever filmed inside the United States, and the third most expensive motion picture in history. Cleopatra cost $44 million. Wow. And the Russian version of War and Peace cost $100 million. Star Trek is going to have to earn $84 million and maybe as much as $126 million, depending on deals and whatever, before it can actually show a profit. So kind of interesting.
Wow.
Now I didn't see a Susan Sackett report in this issue, so I think this is the issue that she stops. Yeah.
So she's done after the motion picture.
Right.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, kind of. This issue also has an interview with Robert Wise, who's obviously the director of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And he's mainly around the motion picture and its challenges. There's also an article on the birth and death of Gene Roddenberry's Questor tapes.
Yeah. It was a quick birth and death.
Yes, it was. All right, now we're into the 80s, but I think we need to talk about issue 33, which came out April 1980.
So that's really talking about like the December, January time period, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right when the movie comes out or just after.
Yep.
And the big thing with this issue is there's three reviews from columnists Starlog columnists in this. Ooh. And so there's a new article called Fanzine by Bijo Trimble.
Oh, cool. Bijo.
So Bijo's starting her article, and she's basically taken over Susan Sackett's column. But the reviews, one is by Harlan Ellison, and this you got to read it. I've read it. And he, you read Harlan's stuff, and he is very, and I'll put it in eloquently, very good with words.
He's dry. He's witty. He's acerbic.
Yes. And he speaks his mind. So, and this is 3 pages out of the whole Starlog magazine. So let me just read a little bit. And just kind of a note here, he prefaced this by lots of preface in the review. saying that, hey, this is my opinion. Sorry, I know you guys, I've worked with you. I know Gene and I have had some back and forth over the years, but really, I've not taken that into account. This has nothing to do with, our relationship. And he says, he has a quote here: "The mark of Gene Roddenberry's limits as a creator of stories is heavily, indelibly, and inescapably on this production. The script has all of the same dumb flaws that were perpetrated in the series, with bigger, prettier pictures." Oh yeah, it's harsh. And this goes on for 3 pages. Remember, the basic story, for all of its latest state of the art and its tricked up Trekkiness, is Gene's standard idea, done so often in the series. We go into space, we find God, and God is, and you pick one, male, violent, crazy, whatever, or a child.
Yeah, right.
So he goes on about the actors, and he really only thinks that the 2 people that did a good job were Nimoy and DeForest Kelley. So read it, though. It's interesting. So in David Gerald's Rumblings, he reviews the motion picture, and he basically calls it Spocalypse Now.
Oh.
Yeah, so kind of harsh. And letters that were sent in that are published in the communication section, there's positives and negatives. So, go figure. The movie was what you would expect.
So like Star Trek fans, today the movie was a mixed bag right after it came out, too.
Right, exactly. So, with that, we're not going to cover any more Starlog since it's into the 80s. But let's just end up with, on December 5th, 2007, there was a warehouse fire in Oregon, Illinois, and it destroyed all of the back issues of Starlog.
Oh.
So you can't go buy them anymore. On top of that, in June 2008, all the assets were sold, and by December 2008, the official website and the last remnants of Starlog and Starlog.com ceased to operate. So now you can only find Starlog Magazine in your memories and physical copies that you can find on eBay or private collectors.
Next week, we look back to see what we knew about Star Trek in 1970.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.